I never imagined I'd be writing this. Not at my age. Not like this, late at night. While the house is quiet and my hands tremble slightly from nothing more than old age. But some memories don't wait for permission. They sit with you, pressing, until you speak or they eat you from the inside. The first thing I need to tell you is this. There was a moment in the war, in northern France in '44, that I can't forgive myself for. I didn't do something I should have done. I froze. I chose my own skin over another man's life. And I carried that choice like a stone in my chest for 70 years. I was 22, scared, mostly untested, and we had been marching through the hedgerows after Normandy. Days blurred together, mud, ration tins, the smell of smoke and wet wool. I remember a letter in my breast pocket from my sister, telling me about home, about the garden she'd started, how she wished I could see it. I carried it everywhere. It was my only tether to something that wasn't war. There was a man, Harris, in my unit, quiet, steady. We had survived an ambush together the week before, and I trusted him with my life, or I thought I did. I've never stopped thinking about the moment when the choice came, the one that would define everything after. We were given orders that night, and on the edge of a burned-out village, we came across a group of civilians. One of them, an older man, stood in the road, looking at us as if he knew the danger he was in. Harris hesitated. I hesitated, and I did nothing. I can still hear the wind through the crumbling houses, the clatter of my own boots on broken pavement, and the sudden horrible awareness that we had power over another person's life. I made no sound. I made no move. I convinced myself I was following orders, staying safe, doing what any soldier would do. But that's not truth. I knew, and I let it pass. At the time, I didn't realize what that choice would cost, not in days, not in months, but in decades. It stayed with me in quiet moments. Reading a newspaper, walking down the street, hearing children laugh. That silence, that wait. I wish I could tell you more, but I have to start somewhere. And starting means leaving the worst part for later. You'll understand soon enough why this night haunts me, why the letter in my pocket became heavier than ever, and why Harris and I, he never spoke of it either, were never the same after. Because even as we marched on, something inside me had already broken. The days after that night were quieter on the surface, but inside, everything was louder than ever. I kept moving, following orders, marching through fields and hedgerows, eating what little we had, sleeping when exhaustion finally dragged me down. But the memory of those two men never left me, not for a second. Harris tried to act as if nothing had happened. He joked more than usual, tried to fill the silence between us with easy conversation. I played along, because pretending was safer than facing what I knew. That we had both carried a weight we could never share. I began noticing other small things that reminded me of our failure. The abandoned shoes in a ruined house. The frightened eyes of a girl hiding behind a shutter. The quiet hush of a village that had once been alive. Every detail seemed to whisper the same truth. Inaction and obedience had consequences that were more lasting than any battle wound. Then came the day I almost broke completely. We were ordered to set up a temporary outpost in a farmhouse on the edge of the village. As I stepped inside, I saw a small bundle under the table. A child, no older than 6, shivering, eyes wide. The thought hit me immediately. What if we had passed by another child that night? The night I chose obedience over action. What if my hesitation had cost someone everything? I froze. I wanted to act, to take the child and protect them, but I was paralyzed by fear of the order, of the consequences, of myself. Harris noticed my hesitation. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. I could see the same dread mirrored in him. For a moment, I felt the weight of all the choices I hadn't made pressing down on me. And I understood that some moments in war can't be undone, no matter how desperately you wish they could. I spent the rest of the day trying to erase the image of that child from my mind. I ate, I marched, I tried to sleep, but it lingered, like smoke in a room that can't be aired out. I kept a letter from my sister folded in my breast pocket, touching it over and over, hoping it could tether me to some trace of morality, of the person I had been before this war made monsters of us all. By nightfall, I knew something had shifted irreversibly. Not in the army, not in the mission, but in me. The quiet part of my soul that still cared about right and wrong had begun to crack, and I realized that eventually that crack would widen into a chasm, and I would have to confront it alone. Only then did I understand. The war outside was terrible, yes, but the war inside me, the one I had started by choosing safety over action, would last far longer than any battle. Part 6 will move toward the breaking point, where the narrator faces an irreversible emotional and moral collapse, showing how the burden of choice becomes unbearable. The morning after that night, everything felt different. The air was thick with fog and gunpowder smoke, though no shots had been fired. Harris walked beside me, quiet as ever, his eyes fixed on the ground. I wanted to speak, to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. What could I say that wouldn't make me feel smaller than I already did? We were ordered to scout a farmhouse just beyond the hedgerows. The place looked abandoned, broken shutters, a collapsed roof. But there was a smell, faint and bitter, that made my stomach twist. Something had been left behind. Something alive, or maybe just a trace of it. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter. It was routine. Another day, another task. And yet, every step I took across that muddy field reminded me of the man in the road the night before. The memory clung to me like a shadow that wouldn't lift. Harris tried to lighten the mood. He joked about missing the army rations, about how awful the stew had gotten in the past week. I laughed, a hollow sound, because it felt safer than admitting what I was really thinking. And yet, I watched him. I watched the way he carried himself, steady but tense. And I realized he, too, had seen the moment. He had felt it. I found a small object in the farmhouse, a child's boot, cracked and mud-caked, tucked under a beam. I picked it up. The leather was stiff, the stitching frayed, and I remembered my own boots from that morning, polished and new, and how I had marched past a man who might have needed me to act. That tiny boot became an anchor to the guilt I couldn't name yet. We stayed there only a few hours. No enemy, no action, just cold and quiet. But I couldn't shake the thought that what we had failed to do the night before had left a mark. Not just on the man in the road, but on both of us. I wanted to tell Harris how I felt, but the words remained buried under duty and fear. There's one part of this I avoided remembering for years. The way I looked at him then. Not Harris, exactly, but the uniformed men around me, the ones obeying orders without hesitation. I asked myself quietly, almost to the earth itself, if obedience is the same as innocence, and I didn't have an answer. By the time we returned to camp, the fog had lifted, but the heaviness didn't, and I knew that what we had done, or failed to do, was just the beginning. It happened sooner than I expected, not with a bang, not in battle, but in a quiet moment that left me hollow. We were ordered to guard a small supply route outside the village. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the road. Harris was beside me, as usual, silent. I should have been watching alert, ready for anything. But my mind kept returning to that night, to the men we had turned over, to the child I had almost held. Each memory was a knife twisting slowly inside me. Then I saw him, a man older than I remembered, trudging along the road carrying a bundle. Something in his face made me freeze. Recognition, maybe, or just the unbearable weight of human fear. I wanted to call out, to warn him, to do something, anything. But I didn't. My body refused. My mind argued, "You will get killed. This is not your choice. Stay in line." Harris glanced at me, his eyes sharp for the first time in days, and I knew, without a word, that he understood what I was thinking, what I was failing to do. And in that moment, I realized we were both broken in the same way, by the same invisible act. I had carried a burden for decades in silence, but now, for the first time, I felt it physically, pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe. It wasn't the war outside. It wasn't the Germans we faced. It wasn't even the hunger or the mud. It was the knowledge that I had chosen myself over someone else, that I had let fear govern my actions. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in my tent, listening to the wind rattle the canvas, feeling the letter in my breast pocket like a weight of its own. And I asked myself quietly, in a voice I barely recognized as mine, would you have done differently? I didn't have an answer, and I suspect I never will. By the time morning came, I had crossed some line inside me I could never return from. The part of me that had once believed in doing right, in protecting what little humanity survived in war. It was no longer whole. I could feel the rest of the campaign pressing in, but nothing mattered as much as that quiet, internal collapse. And I knew the next time the choice came, one I could not avoid, it would define everything that remained of me. The days that followed blurred into one another, a slow, grinding march through mud, rain, and the constant drone of distant artillery. There was no rest, no real reprieve. We learned to survive in silence, to obey without question. But inside, something was fraying. I could feel it in Harris, and I could feel it in myself. We were ordered to occupy a small village that had seen better days. Most of the buildings were intact, but the streets were empty, save for the occasional figure darting behind shutters or through doorways. The villagers watched us with suspicion, fear, and something else, something that made my stomach tighten. Accusation. It was during that first night in the village that it happened. We heard a cry, a child, I think, coming from the corner house, the one closest to the road. Harris hesitated. I hesitated. And then when we moved in together, rifles ready, expecting resistance. Inside, there was nothing but shadows, the smell of smoke and damp. But on the floor, there were remnants of a family's life, a plate broken, a scorched blanket, and a small, tattered toy. I knew immediately that the fear outside had followed them in. The villagers hadn't hurt us. We had hurt them by simply being there. I wanted to leave it, to convince myself we had done nothing wrong. But Harris, careful and steady, looked at me with something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Doubt, shame, and perhaps a silent question about what kind of men we were becoming. I remember thinking, quietly, almost to myself, that war wasn't about heroics or bravery. It was about survival, and survival meant choices. And sometimes, the right choice felt impossible to make. Only later did I understand what we had really done that night. Only years later did I realize that in our inaction, in our cautious obedience, we had drawn a line. And once it was crossed, there was no going back. The thing that haunts me most, even now, isn't the orders, the fear, or the mud under my boots. It's the silence between Harris and me afterward, that wordless acknowledgement that we had failed together and that the failure was ours alone. And yet, I held on to one small object, a letter in my breast pocket, still folded from weeks ago. I touched it often, as if it could remind me of something better, something purer than what I had become. But the weight of that night pressed harder than ever, and I knew that no letter, no memory of home, could lift. By dawn, the village was quiet again. But inside me, the quiet was something different. It was uneasy, it was heavy, and it was relentless. I can't tell you yet what would break me entirely, but it's coming. And when it does, there will be no hiding, no excuses left. It came sooner than I feared, or perhaps I was too exhausted to fear it properly. We were sent to secure another village, one closer to the front lines. The roads were churned to mud, and the wind cut like a knife. I had hoped, in some small, foolish way, that maybe this time I could act differently, that maybe I could make up for the failures that had haunted me for weeks. But war has a way of testing you in the worst ways, and it tests your courage when the cost is highest. It was a quiet afternoon when the scream came. From a barn, small, terrified, pleading. My stomach knotted instantly. I knew without seeing what had happened. Civilians, caught in the crossfire we couldn't avoid, in part because of the hesitation and silence I had allowed to become habit. Harris froze beside me. I froze too. Time slowed, stretched, like it does in the moments you know you're powerless. I wanted to act. I wanted to protect, to intervene, to stop it. But I had learned something horrifying. Inaction had become instinct. Fear had become muscle memory. I did nothing. The screams ended. Silence fell, heavier than any gunfire. Harris didn't speak. I didn't speak. We moved on as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Inside me, something broke that could never be repaired. That night, I touched the letter in my pocket again and realized that no memory of home, no tether to what was good or innocent, could undo what I had allowed to happen. I thought of the man on the road months ago, the two men in the barn, the child I could not save, and I understood fully, finally, that the war outside had ended long ago in my heart. What remained was the quiet cost, the internal wounds that no medal, no commendation, no letter from home could ever reach. I left the battlefield with my body intact, but the rest of me carried scars no one could see, and I have carried them ever since. Even now, as I write this, I feel the weight pressing down. The same weight that has shaped my life for decades. The days stretched on like a slow, gray river. Food was scarce, sleep rarer, and every step felt like walking on the edge of a blade. I had begun to notice things about myself I didn't like: how easily I followed orders without questioning them, how quickly I could shut down the voice in my head that asked, "Is this right?" It was late afternoon when the moment came that I can't forget. We were clearing a barn on the outskirts of the village. Harris and I moved in together, rifles at the ready. Inside, crouched in the corner, were two men, young, terrified, barely able to stand. I recognized the look in their eyes instantly, the same look I'd seen in the man on the road weeks before. Powerless, waiting, hoping. The orders were clear: take them for questioning. But there was a rumor, whispered among the older soldiers, that these men had sheltered insurgents. My heart hammered. I could have hesitated, refused, or done something else. Anything. But the instinct to obey, to survive, was stronger than the instinct to act morally. Harris looked at me. I can still see it, clear as if it were yesterday. His eyes asked, the same question mine refused to. Do we do this? Or do we risk everything? I chose the safe path. I stepped forward. I followed the order, and in that choice, Something inside me shifted irreversibly. The men were taken away. I don't know what happened after. I didn't ask. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility, that I had a duty, that questioning orders would get me killed, or worse, my friend. But every night after, in the dark, I could hear their voices, silent, accusing, endless. I kept my face neutral. I kept my distance from Harris, who never spoke about it either. But I could feel it, the invisible line between us, drawn in shame and fear. And I realized something I didn't want to admit. Survival had required a betrayal, not of others, not of the army, but of myself. That night, back in my tent, I touched the letter in my pocket again. The garden my sister had described seemed impossibly far away, like another life, and I understood that some lines, once crossed, could never be erased. There's a part of me I almost lost that night, a quiet human part that had still believed in goodness, even in war. And I can't tell you yet if I managed to save it, because what came next would test me in ways I never imagined. I returned home in '45, like so many others, changed in ways no one could see. The streets were the same, the smells familiar, the gardens growing. But I was different. The war had left me alive, yes, but hollow in ways that no letter or medal could fill. Harris returned too, though we never spoke of what had happened. Not the men, not the child, not the choices we had made. We pretended it was all behind us, and yet, the silence between us, the invisible acknowledgement of our failings, lasted for decades longer than any combat. I married. I had children. I worked. I laughed. I tried to fit into a world that had not been at war, but in quiet moments, reading the newspaper, hearing a child cry, feeling the cold wind, I felt the weight of those decisions pressing on me. The letter from my sister, once a tether to home, became a reminder of the distance between the person I was and the person I had become. Now, late in life, I write this because the burden has grown too heavy to carry alone. I am not seeking absolution. I am not asking for praise. I simply want the truth to exist somewhere outside my own mind. That survival and obedience can leave scars deeper than any bullet wound, and that the choices we make, or fail to make, echo far beyond the moment they are made. I do not know if I can ever forgive myself. I only know that memory is relentless, and responsibility never ends. If you read this, I ask quietly, without preaching, without judgment, consider the weight of what it means to act and to fail to act. Ask yourself, would you have done differently? Would you have known the cost before it was too late? Because in the end, the war that truly mattered was the one inside me, and that one lasts a lifetime.